Imagine catching your boyfriend sleeping with your sister, then falling for his father. Sounds insane, right? But this story gets even worse, because his father wasn't just some rich older man. He was a former Mafia boss hiding behind a professor's suit. And the moment she kissed him, she didn't just break one rule. She started a scandal that could ruin her future, destroy his life, and drag both of them into a world neither of them could escape.
Feels. Isabella Ricci used to believe that the worst kind of pain came with warning. A crack in the voice, a message left on read, a distance that slowly widened until love became a hallway you were walking alone. She was wrong. The worst pain was immediate. Feels. Clean. Violent. The kind that split your life into before and after in less than 10 seconds. On the night everything changed, she was wearing a black dress Adrian liked, because he once told her it made her look older, smarter, more suited to his world. Feels. Adrian Vale came from one of those Milan families that wore wealth like a second skin. Quietly, without effort, the old money kind, the kind that owned buildings with names instead of addresses. Feels. He had texted her that evening with something casual and charming, telling her to come to the family palazzo after the academic fundraiser began, that they could steal a little time upstairs before he had to go back down and smile for donors. Feels. She should have said no. She had a paper due. Feels. She had a headache. She had spent the whole day feeling vaguely out of place in a life that never seemed to fit her properly. But Adrian had that effect on her. He knew how to make an invitation sound like a reward. So she went. She took the tram, heels, then walked the last block in heels that pinched, through a district where the buildings looked like they had witnessed 300 years of power and learned not to comment on any of it. The palazzo was lit from inside like a cathedral. Marble foyer, heels, tall ceilings painted with saints and clouds, flowers everywhere, staff moving quietly with silver trays. Isabella was a graduate student in literature, not a social climber, heels. But over the last year, she had learned how to stand still in beautiful rooms and look like she belonged there. That was one of the first lessons Adrian had taught her. Smile softly. Speak little. Never look impressed. Heels. She climbed the stairs, heart beating with the kind of nervous excitement that used to feel like romance. The hallway upstairs was quieter. Music drifted faintly from below. A door stood half open. She heard Sophia first, her own younger sister, Heels, breathless, laughing, saying Adrian's name in a tone Isabella had never heard before and understood instantly. Her body knew before her brain did. That is the ugly thing about betrayal, Heels. It is often recognized at the level of instinct long before language arrives. She stepped closer, saw the shoes on the floor, saw Adrian's shirt, saw her sister's hand against silver sheets. Then the full picture slammed into place, Heels. Adrian in bed with Sophia, not confusion, not an all a misunderstanding, just sex, just choice, just a repeated private decision being dragged into the light. Adrian turned first. His face changed color, Heels. Sophia looked irritated before she looked ashamed, and that detail would wound Isabella more deeply than the act itself, Heels. Shame would have meant she understood the damage. Irritation meant Isabella was simply inconvenient. Adrian got up halfway, stammering her name, but Sophia was the one who spoke with that same cool cruelty she had carried since childhood. Heels. You had to know something was wrong, she said. You and Adrian were never really right together. Isabella did not scream. That surprised her. For years she had thought she was the emotional one in the family, the sensitive one, Heels, the one who felt too much. Yet in the worst moment of her life, she went strangely still. She asked how long. Adrian said 3 months. Sophia didn't deny it. 3 months, long enough to build a lie with furniture. Long enough for family dinners, Heels. Shared rides, holiday photos, little acts of sisterhood that now looked rotten from the inside. Isabella looked at Adrian and finally understood that what she had called love had often been performance. He liked being admired. He liked being chosen. Heels. He liked being the sort of man other women wanted and one woman patiently forgave. Sophia liked winning. And Isabella, raised to make peace, had offered herself as the field where both of them could play. Heels. She turned and walked out because staying would have made her a witness to her own humiliation. The hallway felt endless, her vision blurred. She moved too quickly around a corner, clipped her temple against the edge of a half-open study door, Heels, and stumbled inside before the tears could fully break. She wanted a room, any room, a place where she could lose the shape of herself in private. Instead, she crashed into a man, solid chest, warm hands catching her before she fell. Heels. He smelled faintly of smoke, cedar, and something darker beneath that, like old leather after rain. She looked up and found a face that did not belong to a party. Older, sharper, controlled. Silver at the temples, scar through one eyebrow. Heels. Eyes so dark they looked almost black in the lamplight. Heels. He took one glance at her and said, "You're bleeding." His voice was low and calm, not soft exactly, but steady in a way her world suddenly was not. She touched her temple and saw blood on her fingers. Heels. He guided her to a chair near the fireplace with an authority that did not feel theatrical, only practiced. He brought a first aid kit from a side cabinet, knelt in front of her, cleaned the cut with careful hands. No flirtation, no false comfort. Heels. No questions asked too soon. That restraint mattered. Later, Isabella would think about it often. In a world full of men who took advantage of vulnerable moments, the first thing that made her trust him was what he did not do. He did not lean in. Heels. He did not call her beautiful. He did not try to turn her pain into an opening. He treated her like a human being who deserved dignity before anything else. When he asked her name, he repeated it correctly. Isabella. The vowels rounded. Gentle. Heels. He offered her water first. Heels. Then a small glass of whiskey only after. She nodded yes. He did not pressure her to talk, but silence sat so safely in that room that words eventually came. She told him enough. Just the fact of it. Boyfriend. Sister. 3 months. Heels. He listened without interruption, except once, when she muttered that maybe she had not been enough. Then his whole expression hardened in a way that startled her. Do not shrink yourself to explain their character, he said. Heels. Their betrayal belongs to them, not to your worth. It was such a clean sentence, such a precise one. She felt it land somewhere deeper than comfort. In the days that followed, Heels, she would realize that the beginning of healing is often not a grand gesture. Sometimes it is simply hearing one true sentence at the exact moment you are most ready to believe a lie about yourself. They talked in pieces after that. Not like strangers, Heels. Exactly. More like two people who recognized grief in each other. Heels. He told her his name was Vincenzo. He did not offer a surname. He said crowds tired him, that he was only downstairs because obligations do not disappear, just because one grows old enough to dislike them. She noticed the books first. Italian poetry. Heels. History, philosophy, margins marked in a sharp hand. When she asked if he was a collector, he almost smiled and said he taught. She laughed weakly and said he did not look like any professor she had ever met. That, he replied, Heels, depends on how many honest professors you've met. At some point, food arrived. He must have asked a member of staff to bring it up, because a tray appeared with warm bread, cheese, sliced pears, and tea. He watched until she ate. Heels. Not because he wanted gratitude, because he wanted her body to remember that it still deserved care even when her heart had been wrecked. That mattered too. So many people think romance is built on intensity. Heels. Isabella would later learn that real attachment often grows from something quieter. Attention, discipline, the ability to notice when another person is in pain and meet that pain with steadiness instead of appetite. When she finally stood to leave, Heels, the room had changed her, though she did not yet know how much. He called his driver rather than let her search for a cab in that state. She gave him her address and then paused, embarrassed by it, aware of the difference between his world and hers. Heels. But he did not blink. He opened the car door for her himself and said, "This is not the end of your life. It only feels like one because the old story is breaking." That line stayed with her too. On the drive home, she cried so hard she made herself dizzy. Heels. Not only because Adrian was gone, or because Sophia had crossed a line she would never be able to uncross, but because a stranger had shown her more respect in 1 hour than the people closest to her had managed in years. Heels. She went home, blocked Adrian, silenced Sophia, and sat on the bathroom floor until dawn. Her apartment was small, functional, student cheap. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no cinematic collapse, just fluorescent light, cold tile, Heels, and the dull ache of finding out that some people love you only as long as you remain convenient. By morning, she made herself shower, tie up her hair, and go to campus. That was another thing about Isabella. She bent, but she kept moving. Heels. She entered the lecture hall with swollen eyes and a headache that medicine could not touch. Students were already seated, gossiping about a professor on medical leave and a replacement taking over for the semester. Isabella barely listened. Heels. Then the room quieted. A familiar voice said, "Good morning." She looked up and forgot how to breathe. Vincenzo, at the front of the classroom, sleeves rolled, dark shirt, chalk in hand. feels. And in that instant, the universe stopped feeling random and started feeling cruelly designed, feels. He looked at her too, only for a fraction of a second, but long enough for recognition to pass between them like a spark in dry air. Then his face settled into something unreadable, and he introduced himself as Professor Moreau. Not Morrow. Moreau, feels. A name adjusted for academia, for distance, for a cleaner life. He wrote it on the board in a firm hand and began lecturing on Petrarch, as if the world had not just tilted beneath both of them. Isabella sat frozen through the first 10 minutes. Feels. Then another shock landed. He mentioned Adrian, not by name in class. Later, afterward, when he asked her to stay for a moment and with visible restraint admitted he had not known the Isabella his son was dating was the same Isabella from his study. Feels. She stared at him. He stared back. There it was, another fault line. He was not just the man who had seen her broken. He was Adrian's father, older, more dangerous, more self-possessed, and somehow that made perfect sense. Adrian had inherited the charm, feels. Not the gravity, not the substance, not the conscience. Isabella told him she would transfer sections if needed. He told her not to punish her own education because his family had behaved badly. His tone was professional, strict, feels. But something troubled moved beneath it. What happened between you and Adrian is over, he said. In this room, you are my student. I will treat you exactly as I treat everyone else. It should have reassured her, feels. Instead, it hurt in a way she could not explain. Not because she wanted special treatment. She didn't. But because she had already seen the man behind the professor, and now she was expected to pretend that night in the study had never happened. Still, feels, that was safer. More ethical. More real. So did he. And that should have been the end of the story. In real life, sometimes it would have been. But reality is not neat. People do not feel according to policy. Feels. Desire does not vanish because it is inconvenient. Feels. More importantly, respect does not vanish either, and respect was the first dangerous thing growing between them. Not lust, not fantasy, respect. The most intimate form of being seen. Feels. The next few weeks did not turn into instant passion. That would have been less believable and far less interesting. What happened instead was slower, more plausible, more unsettling. Vincenzo proved almost immediately, feels, that he was the sort of professor students either feared or adored. There was no middle ground. He was demanding without being petty, brilliant without performing brilliance for applause. He expected people to read closely, think clearly, feels, and stop hiding behind jargon. If your sentence needs 5 abstractions to make a point, he said on the second day, you probably don't have a point. Half the class laughed. The other half panicked and opened the reading more carefully that night, feels. Isabella found herself pulled in despite everything. It was impossible not to be. He taught literature like it mattered to the body, not just the mind. Desire in poetry was not an old theme to him. It was a moral question, feels. Power in narrative was not theory, it was structure, feels. Violence was not metaphor unless the writer had earned the right to call it one. The more he taught, the more she understood that intelligence could be erotic in a way beauty never had been for her. Not because it dazzled, because it invited, feels. He asked better of his students, and in doing so, assumed they were capable of better. That kind of belief changes people, especially people who have spent most of their lives being underestimated or used, feels. Isabella worked harder in his class than in any other, partly because she wanted to prove to herself that Adrian's betrayal had not broken her. Partly because thinking deeply hurt less than feeling. Partly because Vincenzo made the material feel alive, feels. He did not single her out. He really did treat her like everyone else. Which meant he challenged her in public when her argument was weak, praised the structure of a paper only when it earned praise, feels, and never once let his gaze linger long enough to feed gossip. Yet there were moments, tiny ones, feels. She would make a point about longing in Petrarch, and he would go still for half a beat before responding. A trace of something in his eyes, recognition, appreciation, warning. Once, feels. After she argued that idealization often functions as an escape from the ethical demands of real intimacy, he looked at her with such directness that the room seemed to shrink. Yes, he said quietly, feels. To truly know another person requires more courage than desiring an image. The line was for everyone. It felt like it was for her. That was the problem with chemistry built on mind before body. It hides in respectable places. Office hours, margins, feels, discussions after class. It becomes easy to tell yourself that what is happening is intellectual, that attraction is only admiration with a pulse. Isabella knew enough to be careful. She stayed away the first week except when necessary. Eels. Then came the paper assignment on courtly love, and she had a real question, a real one, not an excuse. Eels. She went in office hours with notes, citations, and every intention of being appropriate. He answered her question precisely. Then another. He did not flirt. He did not soften his standards. He simply engaged her fully. Eels. And she walked out with her chest aching, because there are few things more powerful than being taken seriously by the right person at the wrong time. Adrian, meanwhile, did what weak men often do after betrayal. Eels. He wanted absolution without accountability. He sent messages from new numbers. He showed up outside her building once with flowers she did not accept. He blamed confusion, temptation, Sophia's persistence, stress, alcohol, Eels. Anything but his own character. Isabella saw through it now. A month earlier, she might have listened, hoping for explanation. Now she heard only the flat language of someone desperate to recover his own self-image. When she told him no firmly, Eels, he became resentful. That shift did not surprise her, it clarified him. Eels. Sophia sent one message. We should talk. Isabella deleted it unread. Family, she was beginning to understand, is not sacred when it becomes a place where dignity is repeatedly traded for access. There are betrayals that require forgiveness for peace. Eels. There are others that require boundaries for survival. Around the third week, after a long day in the library, Isabel stayed late and found herself working through Boccaccio with increasing frustration. Eels. She was muttering under her breath when a shadow fell across her table. Vincenzo, without a jacket now, dark sweater, glasses low on his nose. He looked more tired than usual, more human. You are arguing with a dead man in public, he said. Eels. It's a bold strategy. She almost laughed. He deserves it. He glanced at the books. Boccaccio always does. He should have kept walking. Instead, he sat across from her after a pause that should have ended differently. Eels. That was one of the moments later that both of them would replay and assign too much meaning to. In truth, it was small. A conversation in a nearly empty library. Eels. Yet many life-changing mistakes begin in scenes so ordinary no one watching would think to stop them. They spoke for 20 minutes about satire, about whether irony protects or exposes vulnerability. Eels. About the tendency of men in certain literary traditions to call possession devotion. Isabella disagreed with him twice. He seemed to enjoy that. When she built a sharper point than he expected, Eels, his face changed in that rare way it did when a student surprised him, and the warmth in that expression almost undid her. He did not want to impress her. He wanted her to think harder. That made everything worse. Or better, depending on the hour. Eels. As they walked out together, the campus was nearly empty. No music, no rain, no exaggerated romance. Eels. Just old stone buildings, sodium streetlights, and a warm night carrying the smell of dust and leaves. He told her she was one of the strongest readers in the class. She said that sounded suspiciously like favoritism. He replied, No. Eels. Favoritism is praise disconnected from reality. This is observation. She should have stopped the conversation there. Instead, she said, You always know exactly how to phrase things. He looked at her for a long moment and answered, Eels. That has cost me as much as it has served me. There was history in that line. Dark history. She could feel it. Not enough to understand it, but enough to know he was not simply an academic with excellent posture and complicated eyes. Eels. There was weight in him, experience that did not belong to university life. It showed in how quickly he scanned empty spaces, how rarely he sat with his back to a door, how instinctively he measured risk. Isabella noticed. She noticed everything by then. Eels, the scar, the discipline. Eels. The way sadness lived behind his composure like a tenant who had paid a long lease. And because she noticed, her feelings changed shape. They became less about fantasy and more about curiosity, then compassion, then something more dangerous than either. Eels. It would be dishonest to say she was powerless. She was not. She knew the line existed. So did he. They kept stepping near it anyway, not because they lacked brains, Eels, but because two intelligent adults can still make terrible choices when those choices are built from loneliness, grief, recognition, and timing that feels fated when it is really just unfortunate. The first actual crack came on a day of heavy rain. Eels. She arrived to class soaked through because the tram had stalled and her umbrella broke in the wind. He saw her shivering before the room filled, walked down without a word, and handed her his jacket. She said no. He draped it over her shoulders anyway. Eels. The heat of it stunned her, not because it was romantic. Eels. Because it was intimate in the oldest way. Care, immediate and practical. They stood too close. Rain hitting the windows, empty lecture hall. He said too quietly, "You need to stop looking at me like that." She swallowed. "Like what?" Feels. "Like I am safer than I am." Silence. Then she asked the question that had been waiting between them for weeks. "Who are you, really?" He could have lied. He did not. He said he had not always been a professor, that he came from Sicily, Eels, that his family had been involved in organized crime, that he had once been deeply inside a world he now spent his life trying to outrun. Not a cartoon villain, not a glamorous criminal fantasy, a man shaped by violence, complicit in it, Eels, and ashamed enough of it to have rebuilt his life around books because books were one of the few places he had found language for remorse. Isabella stared at him, and to her own surprise, fear was not the first thing she felt. It was clarity. Eels. Suddenly the room in the palazzo made sense. Eels. The guards, the way staff moved around him, the old authority in his body, the scar, the grief. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He looked at her with something raw and exhausted. "Because if you keep moving closer, Eels, you deserve to know the truth before you decide whether I am worth the risk." It was the most ethical sentence a man in an unethical situation could have offered. That was part of what ruined her. He was trying even then to return her agency to her, Eels. Not seduce, not spin. Tell the truth, then let her choose. She stepped closer, nothing dramatic, just enough for both of them to feel the shift. "And if I choose badly," she whispered. He gave a bitter half-smile, Eels. "Then we will have something in common." Their first kiss happened later that day, not in the classroom, not recklessly in public, after hours, after class, after another conversation that should have ended at the door and did not. Eels. It was brief, then not brief, then impossible to recategorize as a mistake. It was not the kind of kiss young women dream about in films. It carried grief, restraint, hunger, and the terrible relief of no longer pretending. Isabella felt recognized in it. Eels. Wanted, yes, but also met. That distinction matters. Many people are desired, fewer are met. When they pulled apart, both of them knew the same thing. This was not safe, it was not wise, it was not innocent. It was also not casual. Eels. That made it far more dangerous than a meaningless affair. Over dinner that night, in a restaurant far from campus where no one knew them, he told her about Elena, his wife, Eels, who had died years earlier because someone meant to punish him chose the easiest wound to strike. He did not tell the story to gather sympathy. He told it because without it she would never understand why he hesitated so violently with her. Eels. He had loved before, loved badly then honestly, lost terribly. Eels. And the lesson grief often teaches people like him is that attachment creates targets. Isabella listened, then told him about growing up beside Sophia, always compared, always subtly pushed into the role of the quieter daughter, the easier one, Eels, the one expected to absorb more than she asked for. That night, more than any kiss, built their bond. Two adults telling the truth about the systems that had shaped them. Family, power, gender, violence, class, loss, Eels. That is what made the relationship feel real, even while it was wrong. It was not simply chemistry. It was recognition without pretense. And that in life is often the doorway through which people walk toward disaster believing they have found home. Eels. Their secret did not explode immediately. Real scandals rarely do. They begin as pattern recognition in other people's eyes. A teaching assistant noticing that Professor Moreau answered Isabella's questions with too much precision, Eels, too much patience. A classmate remarking that she often stayed behind after lectures, a look held half a second too long. Small things, nothing anyone could prove at first. Eels. That was what made the middle of their relationship strangely addictive and quietly terrifying. Outwardly, they were disciplined. Inwardly, they were already rearranging their lives around each other. Eels. They met in places where faculty did not go and students could not afford. Or in neighborhood restaurants with no connection to the university. Or at his apartment, Eels, which sat at the top of a converted industrial building lined with books and softened by almost no decoration except a few old photographs turned face down in silver frames. He cooked sometimes. Not elaborate food, good food. Eels. Simple. Pasta done properly. Fish with lemon. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Isabella laughed the first time she watched him move around a kitchen with the same efficiency she had seen in his study. "You do everything like it matters," she said. Eels. He answered, "Most things matter more than people admit." Those evenings were not all sex. That is another reason the story became dangerous in a way neither of them could dismiss. They built ordinary intimacy. Eels. She left articles on his table with sections marked. He corrected one of her commas and earned a glare for it. He showed her how to slice fennel without bruising it. She learned that he slept lightly and woke early. Heels. He learned that she talked in her sleep when anxious and pulled at loose threads on her sleeve when thinking through difficult ideas. They argued over translations, over whether remorse can ever be complete. Heels. Over whether society is more interested in punishment than transformation. Heels. Those conversations added value to the relationship and also made it harder to leave because they were not built solely on thrill. They fed something else: growth. Isabella became bolder in her thinking, less apologetic. Heels. Less willing to collapse herself to make other people comfortable. Vincenzo became, almost against his will, more emotionally honest, more present, more open to the idea that love after damage does not have to be a repeat of old ruin. Heels. But reality does not care how healing a connection feels if the structure around it is unethical. That is what makes stories like this painful in a human way rather than a romantic fantasy way. Heels. You can do real good for each other and still be wrong in context. That tension began to press harder. Adrian cornered Isabella in a cafe one afternoon and asked, with false innocence, whether she was enjoying being the professor's favorite. Heels. She stared at him. Something ugly and adolescent had entered his face. He was not only jealous. Heels. He was humiliated. A man who betrays often still expects to remain central. Watching Isabella become less reachable unnerved him. Watching his father become somehow involved enraged him. He implied things, suggested she had been opportunistic. Heels. Suggested she liked older men who could do something for her. The insult revealed his worldview more than hers. Isabella saluted, looked him in the eye, and said, with a steadiness she had earned, Heels. The most insulting thing in this conversation is that you still think every choice a woman makes must orbit male approval. Then she left. That line would have meant nothing to the girl she had been before the palazzo. Now it came naturally, Heels. Because one of the educational truths growing inside her through this whole mess was that self-respect is not a feeling first. It is a practice, a decision repeated until your voice begins to sound like your own. Heels. The person who caused the actual explosion, though, was Luca Ferraro, a doctoral candidate. Heels. Teaching assistant, ambitious in the most hollow way. He had asked Isabella out twice before and reacted to her refusal with the oily politeness of a man who files rejection under personal insult. Heels. He noticed more than most because he was the sort of person who mistakes access for insight. When he saw enough small signs, he began collecting them. Not because he cared about ethics, because he cared about leverage. Heels. He raised concerns quietly with a departmental administrator, then more formally, then with embellishment. Adrian, hearing the rumor, added his own poison. He gave statements suggesting he had long suspected inappropriate behavior. Heels. He framed himself as concerned rather than vindictive. Sophia, remarkably, stayed silent. Whether out of shame, self-protection, or boredom, Isabella never knew. The meeting with Dean Caruso came 2 days later. Heels. The summons landed in Isabella's inbox with all the bloodless politeness institutions use before they alter your life. Heels. Vincenzo told her not to lie. That was important. He could have asked her to protect him. He did not. Tell the truth, he said, even if the truth burns me. Heels. They met outside the dean's office in a corridor that smelled faintly of paper and radiator heat. He wore a dark suit. She carried a notebook she did not need, just to have something in her hands. Neither touched the other. Neither had to. Heels. Fear stood between them more intimately than contact. Dean Caruso was not cruel. That is crucial. If she had been cartoonishly punitive, it would have simplified everything. Instead, she was intelligent, direct, and professionally grave. Heels. She explained that allegations had been made of a romantic relationship between faculty and a student currently enrolled in that faculty member's course. She asked if it was true. Isabella heard her own heartbeat. Heard too, Heels, the echo of all the times women are not believed about their own choices. Heels. Yet she also understood, perhaps for the first time, that consent is not always enough to make a structure ethical. Context matters. Power matters. Matters. She said yes. Vincenzo said yes. He clarified the timeline. Heels. He insisted there had been no grade manipulation, no coercion, no favoritism. Dean Caruso likely believed parts of that. It changed nothing. Policy exists partly because even good intentions can distort power. Heels. Isabella argued that she was 23, an adult, capable of decision. The dean replied with a calm sentence Isabella would hate before she understood it. Adulthood does not erase institutional asymmetry. At the time, it felt patronizing. Later, feels, in a more reflective season of life, Isabella would admit it was also true. Truth can wound even when it is fair. Vincenzo was suspended pending investigation. Isabella was transferred out of the course. Feels. The walk down the hallway afterward felt unreal. Students passed them without knowing yet. Feels. He kept his face composed, but she could see the restraint in his jaw. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, I was the one with the position to protect." That also mattered. He did not romanticize the scandal. Feels. He did not hide behind mutual desire to erase the greater burden his role carried. He loved her. He also failed her in that specific, ethical way. Both things could be true at once. That complexity is what makes the story human rather than fantasy. Feels. The rumor spread before sunset. Campus works like that. By the next morning, Isabella could feel eyes on her in hallways. Some people were sympathetic, some fascinated. Feels. Some judgmental in the special tone reserved for women whose mistakes are interpreted as character rather than circumstance. Christina, a classmate with more bluntness than tact, Feels, told Isabella in the restroom that Luca had filed the complaint, and Adrian was telling anyone who would listen that the affair probably began while she was still with him. Feels. Isabella stood at the sink looking at herself in fluorescent light, pale, tired, still standing. That was the image she remembered later, not because she looked glamorous in pain, but because she didn't. Feels. She looked like an ordinary woman learning that public humiliation is survivable. Vincenzo became termination after the ethics review moved faster than expected. His grade record showed no favoritism. Feels. Several students even testified that he was harsher on Isabella in discussion, not kind of it saved him. The policy violation was enough. He was removed. His faculty page disappeared. His office nameplate came down. Feels. A life he had rebuilt over years was taken apart by a set of decisions made over weeks. That was the price. Real, not abstract. Isabella cried in a locked library bathroom when she read the statement. Then he called and she apologized again. Feels. And again he stopped her. "Do not turn my choice into your sentence," he said. "I knew the rules." Feels. It was not noble. It was accurate. The world, however, was not finished exacting from them. That same evening, he told her something he had been hoping not to confirm. A man from his past, Marco De Luca, had been asking questions. Feels. Not in obvious criminal ways. Not enough for police interest. Just enough to be dangerous. Following. Photographing. Letting himself be seen at the edge of places. Feels. Reminding Vincenzo that the old network he had abandoned still understood how to apply pressure. And pressure, in that world, is almost always directed at what a man loves. Isabella listened in silence. Feels. Suddenly, the scandal at the university seemed almost clean by comparison. Rules, investigations, consequences. Those she could understand. This was older, more feral. A former life refusing the idea that a person can ever become new. "What does he want?" Feels, she asked. Vincenzo's answer came flat. "To remind me that men like me do not get to have soft lives without paying for them." Feels. It was the first time she saw him truly split between two selves. The teacher who had built a life of thought, and the man whose instincts were still shaped by danger, retaliation, force. Feels. She said what frightened people in love often say because it feels constructive. "We go to the police." He said what damaged people often say because experience has taught them what institutions cannot do. "Not yet. Not with this," they argued. Feels. Not theatrically, exhaustedly. At his apartment, over cold pasta and untouched wine, he wanted distance for her safety. She called it fear disguised as sacrifice. He wanted control. She wanted partnership. Eventually, in the middle of that argument, Feels, she told him she loved him. Not because timing was right, because terror burns away vanity. He went silent so long she thought she'd broken something. Then he said he loved her too, and that was exactly why he was afraid. Feels. Love is not always healing when it arrives. Feels. Sometimes it reveals how much healing is still unfinished. Feels. The weeks after his firing stripped both of them down to essentials. There was no institutional shelter left, no classroom boundaries pretending to contain what they had already crossed. Feels. No faculty title standing between Vincenzo and the consequences of being a man with a past and a woman in his life who could be used against him. At the same time, there was also no more room for illusion, and that became, strangely, Feels, the most honest period of their relationship. Isabella had a choice now in a way she had not before. She could leave, not dramatically, not because she did not care, Feels. Simply because whatever existed between them had already cost too much and could cost more. Staying would mean choosing a man whose history contained violence, whose recent judgment had failed in ways that affected her education, heals, and whose life was now intersecting again with people capable of intimidation. Walking away would have been reasonable, healthy, many would say. But love is not a legal brief, heals. It includes reason. It is not ruled by it. Isabella asked herself a harder question than whether she wanted him. She asked whether being with him made her smaller or larger as a person. With Adrian, she had bent herself into acceptability, feels. With Vincenzo, even inside chaos, she felt more truthful, more intellectually alive, more respected, more accountable too. He did not flatter her into dependence, he challenged her. When she spiraled into self-blame, he called it out, feels. When she spoke carelessly about herself, he stopped her. That mattered. So she stayed, not because women should save damaged men, not because danger is romantic, feels, but because she made an adult assessment of the man in front of her, rather than the mythology around him, feels. That is one of the human values at the core of this story. People deserve to be judged neither by their polished image alone, nor by the worst thing they have ever done in isolation, feels, but by the truth of who they are becoming and whether they are willing to be accountable for what they were. Marco De Luca made his move in a way that felt realistic, precisely because it was indirect. No kidnapping, no operatic threat, just pressure, feels. A late-night knock on Vincenzo's door from two men who did not bother to hide their affiliation. A message delivered in calm voices. He had embarrassed old associates by living openly, teaching publicly, feels, pretending he had stepped outside the obligations of blood and history. They wanted money, influence, access to a legal property transfer still tied to family holdings, feels. They wanted him reminded that his withdrawal from the network was never fully accepted. And yes, they knew about the girl. They did not threaten Isabella by name, feels. Men like that prefer implication. It allows denial later. It also works better. Vincenzo handled the immediate meeting without violence, but Isabella, listening from behind the bedroom door as instructed, feels, understood enough from tone alone to know that his old world had found them. When he came back to her, his face was closed. He apologized for waking her. That almost made her laugh from sheer disbelief. "You think the problem is sleep?" she asked, feels. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked suddenly older than his years. "The problem," he said, "is that my past has now entered a room where you are." She took his hand. It was cold. That detail frightened her more than anger would have, feels. They spent the next day outlining options like two people trying to solve a problem with adult discipline rather than romantic panic. Financial routes, legal routes, who still trusted him, which former connections might be neutral rather than predatory, feels, whether to leave Milan temporarily, feels, whether to tell anyone else. Vincenzo had spent years building legitimate networks, publishers, former colleagues, feels. A lawyer named Elia Romano, who had once helped him cut ties with certain family-linked assets in exchange for clean disclosures and ironclad distance. Elia became central fast. He was in his 60s, discreet, unimpressed by melodrama, feels, and more than willing to remind Vincenzo that regression into vigilante masculinity would help no one. "You are not 28 anymore," he told him over speakerphone while Isabella listened from the kitchen. "If you solve this with your hands," feels, "the state solves you with theirs." That line mattered. It pushed the story further away from fantasy and back toward reality, feels, where survival often depends less on dominance than on choosing the least destructive strategy, even when pride begs for another. They began documenting everything. Sightings, calls, license plates, feels. The university scandal had sharpened one lesson for Isabella. Institutions can fail, but paper trails still matter. Proof matters. She became methodical, organized. Far from the weeping young woman in the palazzo, feels. She now sat at Vincenzo's dining table building timelines and cross-referencing names. This too was healing. Not because trauma should make people stronger in some inspirational way, but because when life strips away illusion, heals. Practical competence can restore dignity. You cannot always control outcomes. You can control how clearly you face them. During these weeks, Isabella also confronted her family properly for the first time, feels. Sophia appeared outside her apartment one afternoon in a cream coat, looking like she had stepped out of a magazine profile on regrettable people with excellent skin. She said she wanted to explain. Isabella almost told her to leave, feels. Instead, she let her in, because clarity sometimes requires looking damage in the face, feels. The conversation was not cinematic. It was uglier. Sophia admitted she had envied Isabella's capacity for sincerity. She called Adrian a mistake. She said she never expected things to go so far. Eels. Isabella looked at her for a long moment and said something that surprised even herself. You keep using the word mistake because it sounds lighter than choice. Sophia flinched. Good. For once. Isabella did not scream, did not forgive. Eels. She said she was done participating in a family pattern where Sophia took and Isabella adjusted. Then she asked her to leave. There is a valuable human lesson in that moment, too. Healing is not always reconciliation. Eels. Sometimes healing is the refusal to continue a role that rewards your own diminishing. Adrian tried one final time, not out of love, but wounded ego. Eels. He waited outside campus after one of Isabella's new classes and told her his father would ruin her life, that men like Vincenzo only know how to consume younger women until they grow inconvenient. Eels. Isabella listened, then asked him whether he had ever spent 1 hour in his life examining another human being without asking what function they served for him. Adrian, predictably, did not answer. Eels. The tragedy of such men is not only that they harm others, it is that they remain strangers to themselves because entitlement leaves no room for self-scrutiny. As external pressure mounted, Eels, the internal dynamics between Isabella and Vincenzo changed too. The more danger rose, the more his old instincts returned. Hypervigilance, secrecy, a tendency to decide alone. One evening, Eels, after he had taken a call in another room and then announced without discussion that Isabella should stay with a friend for several days until things settled, she finally broke. Eels. You do not get to protect me by erasing me from decisions about my own life, she said. That is not love. That is control wearing noble clothing. He shot back that she did not understand the stakes. Eels. She answered that he was proving exactly why power without transparencies destroys intimacy. The argument was brutal because both were partly right. He knew dangers she did not. She knew the cost of being infantilized under the excuse of care. Eels. In the silence that followed, he sat down, put both hands over his face, and said through his fingers, I do not know how to love without trying to stand between the person and the fire. That sentence cracked something open. Eels. Isabella knelt in front of him and answered, then learn. Because I am not asking you to stop protecting me. I am asking you to stop treating me like I disappear from the equation. Eels. That exchange became one of the emotional pivots of the entire relationship. Love had brought them together. But respect for autonomy would determine whether they could remain together without reproducing the very harms they both claimed to reject. Eels. He listened, really listened. After that, he began including her more directly. Eels. Not in ways that made her responsible for his past, but in the present choices that affected both of them. They met Althea together. They reviewed legal filings together. Eels. When an investigative journalist started sniffing around the university scandal and stumbled too close to Vincenzo's history, they decided together how much to disclose and what to refuse. Transparency did not erase fear. It built trust around it. Eels. The actual resolution to the Marco problem came not through revenge but pressure from a different direction. Elia unearthed financial irregularities tied to a property holding Marco had manipulated. Another former associate, Eels, now legitimate in business and eager to keep criminal residue far from public view, quietly cooperated. The documentation Isabella had helped organize created enough legal exposure that when an official complaint finally went in, Eels, it did not sound like paranoia, it sounded like a pattern. Marco was not arrested for being threatening. Eels. He was investigated for fraud and coercive conduct linked to asset transfers. It was slower than fantasy justice, less satisfying in the moment, more believable, more durable. Vincenzo did not get to beat the past into silence. Eels. He had to outlast it with truth, record, counsel, and restraint. That cost him pride. It may also have saved his future. Once the immediate danger eased, he faced another decision. Milan had become saturated. Eels. The university scandal followed Isabella everywhere. His own professional reputation there was damaged beyond quick repair. Eels. Then a small teaching position, opened in Florence through a colleague who knew enough to respect both his scholarship and the fact that human beings are not reducible to one failure. It was not prestigious. It was not a rescue fantasy. Eels. It was a beginning. He hesitated because taking it would mean leaving the city where Elena had died. Adrian still lived, and his reinvention had first taken shape. Eels. It would also mean asking Isabella to alter her own plans. She surprised him by refusing to let the decision center on sacrifice narratives. Do not ask me to follow you like proof of devotion, she said. Eels. Ask me what life we can actually build that does not destroy either of us. They talked numbers, degrees, commuting, housing, practicality. It was one of the least romantic and most loving conversations they had ever had. Eels. In the end, Isabella completed her year in Milan, traveling frequently. Vincenzo started in Florence, rented a modest apartment, and built slowly. The distance was not glamorous. It was trains, schedules, missed calls, essays, grocery lists, deals, jealousy managed by honesty, fatigue choosing each other again and again in unremarkable ways. Deals. That period taught them perhaps the most valuable lesson in the entire story. Intense love may begin with dramatic collision, but lasting love is proved in logistics, humility, patience, deals, and the willingness to transform habits that once protected you, but now wound the person beside you. They did not become saints, they fought. Isabella resented being publicly judged while Adrian moved through the world with less stain. Deals. Vincenzo struggled with shame over the job he had lost and the students he felt he had failed, but they kept telling the truth. That was their discipline. No disappearing, no noble lies, no silent punishments. Deals. If there is something healing in this story, it lives there. Not in the fantasy that love removes damage, in the harder truth that real love can create conditions under which damaged people behave more responsibly than they otherwise would. Deals. Years later, when people who only knew the outline of their story tried to summarize it, they usually got it wrong. They called it scandal, or obsession, or a twisted romance between a professor with a dark past and a student with poor judgment. Deals. Those descriptions were not entirely false. They were also incomplete to the point of stupidity. What actually happened was that two flawed adults met at the point where each of them was being forced to confront the ugliest version of their own story. Deals. Isabella had to face how long she had mistaken accommodation for love, how deeply family conditioning had trained her to absorb disrespect, how vulnerable a lonely person can become to men who offer status instead of tenderness. Deals. Vincenzo had to face the fact that reinvention is not the same as redemption, that building a respectable life does not erase the ethical duty to wield power carefully in the present. Deals. And that protective instincts become abusive the moment they silence the person they claim to serve. Their relationship survived not because those truths disappeared, but because eventually they both stopped romanticizing them. Deals. Isabella finished her degree with honors. That matters, not because achievement cleanses scandal, but because competence restored something gossip tried to steal from her. She became known not as the professor's girl, Deals, but as a fierce researcher with a gift for close reading and a clear voice on questions of power, gender, and narrative ethics. Her final thesis, revised over 2 difficult years, Deals, explored how literary traditions glorify unequal desire while hiding the cost borne by the less powerful party. Deals. She dedicated it privately to those who learn too late that being chosen is not the same as being cherished. Vincenzo never asked to read that line aloud. He knew enough to leave some truths resting where they were written. Deals. He rebuilt his academic career slowly. Smaller seminars, fewer greater care. Deals. At his new institution, he disclosed enough of his dismissal to comply with policy and accepted restrictions without resentment because he had finally understood that accountability is not humiliation when one has actually caused harm. Deals. He taught brilliantly, more carefully than before, with sharper boundaries. No private dinners with students, no blurred lines disguised as mentorship. In this way, the story added something beyond romance. Deals. It offered a credible model of behavioral change, not self-hatred, not public groveling for performance, real correction. Deals. That matters in a culture that often alternates between excuse and erasure, with very little interest in transformation rooted in responsibility. Adrian faded in the way shallow people often do once the spotlight of drama moves elsewhere. Deals. He married someone appropriate several years later. Whether he learned anything is unknown. Sophia sent one final letter to Isabella after their mother fell ill. It contained an apology that was still too focused on Sophia's own guilt, Deals, but less hollow than before. Isabella wrote back briefly, polite, boundaried, compassion without access. That was another lesson she had grown into. Forgiveness, when it came at all, did not require renewed intimacy. Deals. As for Marco and the remnants of the old life, they did not vanish in a clean cinematic sweep. Trouble rarely does. But distance, documentation, lawful pressure, and time reduced his ability to reach them. Vincenzo remained vigilant. Not paranoid, feels. Not clean of fear either, feels. Just honest about the fact that consequences echo longer for some people than for others. Isabella accepted this not because she enjoyed danger, feels, but because mature love sometimes means understanding the landscape of another person's damage without mistaking it for your personal mission to erase it. They married quietly. No palazzo, no society guests, no family theater, feels. A civil ceremony in Florence with a handful of people who had actually stood beside them when standing there cost something. Ilia came. 2 colleagues. One friend of Isabella's from the university who had refused to reduce her to gossip, feels. The rings were simple, the promises clearer than poetry. To tell the truth before resentment hardens. To respect each other's autonomy even under stress. To choose repair over pride. To never confuse possession with devotion, feels. Those vows were not decorative, they had been earned. When their daughter was born, Vincenzo cried with a vulnerability Isabella had seen only twice before, feels. Once when he first told her about Elena. Once when he thought he might have to send her away for safety. He held the baby with reverence and fear, which is to say he held her like a real father, not a polished one, feels. Isabella watched him and understood that the most radical thing about his life was not that a former Mafia man became a professor. It was that a man raised inside power and violence learned, slowly and imperfectly, to become tender without domination, feels. Their son came 3 years later. More noise, more exhaustion, less sleep, ordinary chaos, the kind that sanctifies nothing and reveals everything. Isabella sometimes laughed thinking of how outsiders would imagine their life full of dark glamour, feels. In reality, it was school lunches, deadlines, pediatric appointments, manuscript edits, arguments about whose turn it was to buy detergent, and late-night conversations about how to raise children who would never mistake fear for respect, feels. That, too, is part of the healing value in this story. We often tell ourselves that extraordinary love must remain extraordinary to be meaningful. But perhaps its deepest proof is the ability to become ordinary without losing reverence, feels. Not all scars disappear inside domestic life. Some become simply less theatrical and more integrated. Vincenzo still woke from bad dreams some nights, feels. Isabella still had moments when betrayal flashed unexpectedly through her system at the sight of a phone face down on a table or a sister laughing with a man she loved in a film scene. But they had learned language for those moments, feels. What story are you telling yourself right now? He would ask when her silence lengthened. That I am suddenly easy to discard, she might answer. Then he would tell her where he actually was. Not defensively, clearly. Here, with you, in this house, feels, choosing this life. When his fear sharpened into secrecy, she had her own line ready. Do not protect me by removing me, feels. He never liked hearing it. This is what growth looked like for them. Repetition, humility, repair. Not becoming different species of people. Becoming more honest versions of the ones they already were, feels. There is no need to lie about the moral complexity of how they began. He was her professor. That was wrong. She was vulnerable. He should have drawn the line sooner and more firmly. Institutions had reason to respond, feels. Yet there is also no need to flatten the rest of the story into punishment porn, where one mistake disqualifies every later act of care, truth, or change. Human beings are not improved by simplistic narratives, even when simplification feels righteous, feels. The actual value in this story lies in refusing that flattening. A young woman learns that her worth does not rise or fall with male selection. An older man learns that love without respect for autonomy becomes another form of violence, feels. Both learn that healing demands boundaries, truth, and accountability more than it demands intensity. Both discover that tenderness is not weakness, that remorse must alter behavior or it is vanity in sad clothing, feels. That respect is the most durable form of passion because it survives contact with reality. Years after the scandal, Isabella was invited to give a guest lecture at a different university on literature and ethical desire. She stood at the podium, feels, notes in hand, and told a room full of students something she wished she had understood at 23. The question is never only who wants whom, she said. The deeper question is what kind of self each person becomes inside that wanting, feels. Does the relationship enlarge your dignity or require you to betray it? Does it make truth easier or harder to speak? Does it respect your freedom or merely flatter your hunger to be chosen? She did not mention Adrian, or Sophia, or the palazzo, feels, or the professor whose jacket once sat over her shoulders like a line crossed too quietly. She did not need to. The wisdom had outlived the incident. In the back of the room, unnoticed by most, heels. Vincenzo listened with his hands folded, and a look on his face that held pride, grief, gratitude, and the humility of a man who knew he had helped shape that voice, only after nearly misusing the power he had over it. When the lecture ended, heels. Isabella found him outside beneath an old plane tree, shedding bark in pale strips. He asked how she felt. She smiled and said, "Like I finally know what story I belong to." He kissed her forehead, not her mouth, heels, because students were nearby, and some lessons do, in fact, take root. Then they walked home together through late afternoon light, past bicycles and bakery windows, and people who did not know a thing about the ruins they had crossed to arrive there. Feels. That was fine. Not every truth needs an audience. Some are lived quietly. Feels. Some are proved not in the drama of their beginning, but in the discipline of what they become. And if there is one final lesson this story leaves behind, it is this. Being loved is not the same as being seen. Being desired is not the same as being respected. And the most life-changing relationships are often not the ones that promise escape from reality, but the ones that force you to become more ethical, more truthful, and more fully yourself within it.